Okay, hi everybody. Hopefully you can all hear and see me okay. We should be live now once again. So it's hi once again from me, Donald Robertson, here in Canada, in Nova Scotia. And hello from my friend Mickey Dog over there behind me. So partly also just to confirm that you're getting audio okay and the video looks okay and stuff. Could you all just take a moment to go to the live chat area on the right hand side of the YouTube player and just say hi and introduce yourself and say what part of the world you're tuning in from today. And I'll just have a quick peek in a moment to check that that's all working okay while I rearrange things on my desktop. From Austria, Sweden, Romania. Cool. Okay, so let's get started because I've got quite a lot of stuff to get through today for week 3 on how to think like a Roman emperor. So the agenda, basically, having done some introductions, I'm going to go and do a little bit of basic housekeeping as usual. Then I'm going to look at the course feedback because we've gathered some midway course feedback. Usually do that at the end of the course. For pilot courses I like to do it in the middle, or if there have been revisions to a course, just so that I can check that there aren't any problems that people are having that could be addressed partway through. I used to run training courses for many years in central London, and it used to drive me crazy. At the end of a long course, we'd say to people, what their feedback was, and somebody would say something like the room was too cold or something that, if they told us at the beginning, we could have just turned the temperature up. So it's good to get feedback as early as possible because there may be things we can just fix or change. It's easy for me even to tweak the contents of the course at this stage within reason. So we're going to have a look at the course feedback. So housekeeping feedback, and then the discussion questions from week 2, the previous week, and the things that people have posted in the course itself. And then I'm going to do a bit of a preview for week 3, which we're just beginning, we're kicking off. And then I'll have a look in the live chat area and I'll answer any questions that you've posted in there today. So housekeeping today is going to be pretty simple. You probably know the routine by now. There's a live chat area that'll disappear at the end. Then the YouTube recording will go up permanently. You can go and view that anytime you like, and there'll be permanent comments at the bottom so we can post links in there and stuff if you need them. If you want to ask me a question, if you can put the @ at Donald in front of it, then it's a lot easier for me to spot it when I'm going through the live chat feed. Otherwise, sometimes if you're talking to other people in there, it's hard for me to kind of spot what questions are addressed to me. So try and think of questions for me today, and if you put @ Donald in front of it, then I'm more likely to spot it. There is a 30-second delay, as far as I can tell, between me saying something and you folks being able to see it at your end. So if you put something in the chat, there'll be a bit of a gap between you typing it and me responding to it potentially. Okay, so let me just check in briefly once again. New Mexico, Amsterdam, Belgium. I'm slightly out of focus. Yeah, the camera will auto-focus, so you'll probably find if I move around a little bit that will change. But hopefully that's okay. Sacramento. Yeah, we've got a very cosmopolitan audience. Even somebody from Scotland. Dun dun dun. But no Canadians so far today. I should yell out the window and see if I can arouse any interest from local Canadians. Okay, so the course feedback, if you haven't already done the brief feedback form, I promise it literally will only take 2 minutes. It's as concise as I could possibly make it. It uses some standard instructional design, e-learning type evaluation questions. They're really short, and then there's room for you just to make your own comments. So we have some ratings from that, and the 3 averages we have, I think we've had about 30 people that have completed it so far. The link is in week 3, which we're about to begin, so as you start week 3 you'll find that link if you haven't already completed the questionnaire. It's never too late to give us your feedback. So for clarity, which is like how clearly worded the contents are. Can you actually understand what the contents are saying? Is it too technical? Is it too confusing? We've got very high scores overall. Like the mean score for that is 4.7, which is what I generally describe as about as good as we could reasonably expect to get it. We're never going to get 100%, but 4.7 is pretty high. Impact, which is how relevant the contents are, like how useful it actually is. You understand what it says, but is it telling you anything of value? And the impact score is 4.6, which is also about as high as we could reasonably hope. Maybe we could like nudge that a little bit more. There were a couple of people that rated it a bit lower, but 4.6 is pretty good. Compares well to other previous courses that we've done and all that I've done and gathered data on. Feasibility is the technical stuff, the actual e-learning side of it, the software side of it. How accessible is the website? This is a different platform from some of the ones we've used before, like Moodle and WordPress. So that's 4.7, which again is about as good as we could hope for. There were 3 people that gave kind of lower ratings for feasibility, but they didn't say what the technical problems were that they had. So if you've had any technical issues accessing the site, please let me know, email me, put it in the comments section somewhere, and I'll look into that. My experience, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, the technical problems that people experience are usually fairly simple to resolve. And bear in mind, if you have problems with the site, we know that it's working well for the other participants, so it's not that it's broken or that a file's not playing. We'll spot stuff like that pretty early on. So there's probably just something at your end that you need a little bit of help with. Okay, so going into the actual qualitative feedback that I gathered as well, things that people have written in their comments. Overall, the feedback was very positive. Consistent with the scores. Particularly people like to focus on practical exercises and the examples from Marcus Aurelius' life, which is good because it's a practical based course about Marcus's life. That's the rationale for it. People liked having the webinars a lot in order to give practical hints and tips and to summarise what the exercises are. So that's good. That's what you liked. One person said that they wanted less theory and more practical stuff, but a couple of other people wanted more theory and less practical stuff. So overall, I think the rest of the feedback that we had from people suggested they thought the balance was about right. So I take it that means that overall we're not too wide of the mark then. There is a consensus though, before somebody in the live chat points this out to me. I'm sure pretty much everybody agrees about this, that week 1 has got too much stuff in it. And I was going to say there's a reason for that, there's an excuse for that, which is, bear in mind that this is a pilot version of the course, so there are going to be some changes to it. After I'd finished creating week 1, somebody pointed out that some people would be completely new to Stoicism and would need a kind of primer in Stoic ethics, so I added that. It took me a little bit longer than I was hoping, so I divided it into 3 separate videos and added some written content as well, so that really padded out week 1, which was already kind of front loaded. And in future versions of the course, the stuff in Stoic ethics will probably be moved into the preliminary section, so you can let me know what you think about that. And maybe some of the other stuff has to be split up a bit and abbreviated as well. But yes, you are right. Week 1 is kind of lengthy. And it would have gone in the preliminary section this time round, but by the time I got around to adding it, a lot of people had already finished that section, so they might have potentially missed it. So I put it in week 1. Someone wanted direction on how to proceed with the material and what kind of pace to take to it. Now, actually, sometimes we find, this is always true running any type of courses, like sometimes people say in the feedback, oh, I'd like more of this or more of that, and it may be that there already is a resource that's relevant that for some reason they didn't notice, or maybe it was added after they joined the course or something. So there actually is a page at the start of week 1 called How to Use the Content, which talks about just kind of hints and tips about what pace to take things at. So my assumption is that people will do it differently, but basically the main thing is the videos and the quizzes and the discussions. And I would say if you're able to plough through all the written content, that's fantastic. Some people racing ahead with that. If on the other hand you're finding it a lot to read, then treat it as optional reference material that you can go back and read later. There were some people that were saying that they were taking a while to work through the written stuff and waiting until they'd finished that before they kind of progressed. You don't have to do that. You could just watch the videos and stuff and progress and do the discussions along with everybody else. Go back and do the reading later or do some of it. But there's deliberately a lot of stuff there. That's my advice. So if you missed that, go back and look at week 1, the page called How to Use the Content. Someone else said, like, if there's a comment section, a discussion area, highlight it by saying something at the top of the page. There should be on most of those pages a bit in italics at the beginning that says, please leave your comments below, but I think I noticed there might be some that I missed, but generally there will be a text at the top that says that. Some people didn't like the format of the comment section. That is something we might have to live with. I generally find these discussion forums online, I've never found one that everybody likes yet, but the one we've got at the moment is not too bad, right? But there could always be improvements to it. A couple of people have just said they didn't like the layout. And then the other thing that came up with maybe 2 or 3 people was about Facebook. There's something I should explain about that. So there are some people that say, let's do everything on Facebook. And in the Facebook group, that's a great resource. Why don't we have the discussion questions there and stuff? Because only 2/3 of the participants use the Facebook group. And whenever I mention that on any course, I'll always get people who will tell me that they really don't like using Facebook and don't have Facebook accounts. So because it's an external resource, it's off-site, they're also generally, that means that you're not going to get everybody accessing it. That's why the main discussion questions have to be located in the course, because basically then we can assume that everybody is accessing them and seeing them. If we do it on Facebook, it kind of excludes people, and some participants will complain about that. Then some people will say, well, why can't we have the discussion questions posted both in Facebook and in the course? Then you get fragmentation, so you're having 2 separate discussions going on in parallel, and that's not really desirable. It's better if we encourage everybody to share the same forum. So although the online courses discussion forum maybe isn't as funky as Facebook, it's a little bit more old-fashioned or whatever, we'll get better discussions going that way overall. We'll get more engagement overall, I think, by doing that. Someone said the Teachable app isn't very good. That's true. It's in beta. There are some limitations to it. What you should find is that the website's mobile friendly anyway. So some people have told me it's easier on mobile devices just to use the website rather than trying to use the app. Although the app is continually being updated, so it will improve all the time. So I've covered the stuff about Facebook. Yeah, Facebook we need to treat basically as being an additional extra for additional discussions, posting reminders, etc. But I don't think it's viable to use it as the main discussion forum. And that's pretty much all from the brief feedback forums, actually, which is cool. We're doing really good for time. Yeah, I thought I had a lot of stuff to cover today. Okay, good. So the comments from week 2, let's go into then. And the excerpt for week 2 was about getting out of bed. And this is an interesting one because people often reference 2 of these quotes as their favourite quotes from Marcus Aurelius. And I think often people don't notice there's actually 4 quotations in the Meditations, at least, where Marcus talks about getting out of bed and what he does first thing in the morning. And in each of them he says something slightly different as well. And the other curious thing about it is one of those passages is very similar, as you've seen, to a passage in Seneca, which maybe suggests that Marcus and Seneca are both drawing upon a common earlier source, which is very likely with the Stoics. Some people might say, well, Marcus might be drawing on Seneca. There's not really any indication that Marcus has read Seneca's philosophical letters, and he never mentions them elsewhere. There's some reference to him in the letters with Fronto. We'll talk a little bit more about Fronto later. But it's fairly negative. It's mainly Fronto kind of whinging about Seneca. But bit of a digression, but there may be a reason why Marcus doesn't mention Seneca. It's unusual for Roman authors writing in Greek to explicitly reference those who wrote in Latin, just maybe some kind of convention that they had. But there was also some indication that the later Stoics didn't like referring to Seneca because they saw him as a controversial figure. So some of the comments that were underneath that, for example, Jan said, it's okay what Marcus said about fulfilling your duty if you have a goal, but what if you have a boring job? So a couple of things I wanted to say about that. First of all, funnily enough, Marcus had a pretty boring job, believe it or not. He was emperor for 19 years, and that part seems pretty exciting and pretty dramatic. We know a lot of dramatic stuff about it anyway. I'm sure there were boring times even then. But for about 23 years, most of which he was appointed Caesar or heir under Antoninus Pius, he essentially seems to have been a high-ranking bureaucrat and virtually never to have left Rome, and to have been a bit of a workaholic, and to spend a lot of his time writing letters and speeches and hearing cases and doing desk work. And even when he was forced to do things like attend the gladiatorial games, chariot races, festivals, etc., funnily enough, he complains about finding that incredibly boring, and that he tried to do work at those events without anyone noticing because it annoyed people to see the emperor, or to see Caesar or the emperor working at the games. If you look at the bonus article on Marcus and the amphitheatre, you'll see some discussion of that, and also how he appears to have tried to turn it into a philosophical contemplation. So he's sitting there bored watching guys fighting in chariot races and stuff. He's not interested in it, but you can see that he tries to make the most out of it if you look at that article. So that kind of brings me back to what would we do today in a boring situation. So the main thing is to bear in mind that the Stoic goal is internal, it's virtue, not external. And the Stoics believe that virtue can be adapted to any situation and that it's always under our control. So theoretically, we're never stuck in that respect in terms of being Stoics. The best way, I think, to approach that is to imagine someone who's a perfect Stoic, the sage, being stuck in a boring job, and ask yourself what would be the most admirable way for them to cope given the limitations of that situation. So patience is a virtue, obviously. Maybe finding ways like Marcus did to make the most out of the limited situation that you're in. Maybe also slowly planning a way out of it and stuff like that. But the basic question is, what would we admire someone else for doing, even if they were in a boring situation? And it seems pretty limited in terms of their options. But that said, of course, it's not easy. Then again, if it was easy, it wouldn't be praiseworthy. Marx mentioned self-penned version of morning meditation that he reads every day. Galen said that he read the golden verses of Pythagoras every day. I think he says he reads them out loud or reads them 3 times or something, which is curious because both Seneca and Epictetus mentioned the golden verses of Pythagoras as well. And Zeno wrote a book about the Pythagoreans right at the beginning of Stoicism. So it may have been quite common for Stoics to recite that actual text. And also it's quite possible that Marcus read some of the passages from the Meditations to himself every day. We hear about other Stoics writing consolation letters to themselves, and that's similar to a whole raft of techniques that are used in cognitive therapy, ranging from writing and repeating pithy, laconic coping statements to writing longer scripts or journals and then reviewing those daily. There's a lot of variety, but essentially these are all related things. The Earl of Shaftesbury wrote his own entire version of the Meditations. This is one of the books that I recommend. It's the Philosophical Regimen of the Earl of Shaftesbury, Anthony Earl of Shaftesbury, the third Earl of Shaftesbury. So you could do what Marcus did and write your own version of the Meditations, or you could just write some coping statements and review them every day, or there are a number of different ways that you might want to write a script, which I think I'm going to return to later. Melissa mentioned the contemplation of the stars as an exercise. It's in one of the quotes, isn't it? And in one of the excerpts. I wanted the course to be mainly original material, by the way, stuff that's not available anywhere else. But I have also added some relevant material from my blog, just because I thought it might be useful, but I've always marked that as bonus material. It's not central to the course. It's stuff that I've lifted from my blog that happens to be about Marcus. So treat that as optional extra stuff. But one that I haven't added yet is an article about Marcus and the cult of Mithras, which is one of the Roman mystery religions, because it's kind of based on circumstantial evidence, but I think it's likely, very likely, that Marcus was initiated into Mithraism. Mithraism was very popular with the Roman army, especially in the northern frontier, and there have been more temples of Mithras excavated in Carnuntum, where Marcus was stationed, than anywhere else, as far as I'm aware. It seems to have been like a kind of focal point for the cult of Mithras. Now, one of the weird things about it is those little temples had arched ceilings. They were full of astrological symbols, and the ceilings were painted blue with stars on them. So it seems that as part of the rituals, presumably, that they carried out in there, when you went in, lit by candles or whatever, some of them I think are underground, it would look like you're in among the stars. Of course, it's striking then in the Meditations, Marcus mentions several times. In one passage in particular, he talks about being among the stars. He must have seen one of these buildings, so that's intriguing anyway, I think. But that's not an article that I've added yet. Some of you might be interested in it though. Steve said it's hard to understand what the Stoics mean by nature. Yeah, people say that a lot. And actually the Stoics would have agreed with that. They thought they were proposing something radical. They thought, in a sense, philosophy had to begin by asking yourself what a man is, what human nature is. And that we had to radically revise the way that the majority of people conceive of human nature. And they bolstered that with a number of arguments. To say that instead of just kind of thinking of ourselves as human beings in the way that we normally do, just creatures that have a certain physical makeup, they thought being a human being consisted fundamentally in having the intellectual, the reasoning, thinking capacities of a human being, and that was more important than the way that our bodies looked. So the famous definition that's attributed to Plato of man as a featherless biped, the Stoics would say that's a ridiculous definition, or it's a kind of caricature anyway. It's meaningless to think of ourselves in terms of our outward appearance. What really matters is our capacity for thinking. So Marcus has that in mind when he's focusing on fulfilling our nature very much. It's fulfilling our capacity for thinking, reasoning, and grasping the truth. And then the Stoic ethics really develops from that. So that's a little bit about some of the comments on the excerpts. In the main discussion area, the questions were things like, what do you think Stoicism can teach us about managing worry and anxiety? This is one of my pet subjects as a cognitive therapist. Noble said the morning and evening exercises are really useful. I would agree with that. And most of the protocols I've designed, there's something similar. I call them kind of bookends. I think if you're following a systematic daily routine, a regimen, having a morning and evening routine, a preparation routine and a review routine as part of a learning cycle, if you approach that properly, it's extremely important, and that gives you a framework that you can fit any number of different techniques into. But that's an integral part of it. Every day you should be learning, revising, moving forward in your practice. That's a good way to do it. The Golden Verses of Pythagoras mention this thing about reviewing everything you did through the day 3 times. Seneca talks about that. Epictetus mentions that as well. Melissa says the reserve clause is very important, very valuable. Yeah, that's something that doesn't really get brought out in the same way in modern therapy, but it's one aspect of Stoicism that people talk about a lot and find incredibly useful. So it's obviously complementary to ideas that we have in CBT, but it's one of those ideas that people value in Stoicism, and it's kind of surprising that something similar isn't referenced more often in modern therapy. You can find parallel ideas, but there's not as much emphasis on it. It suggests maybe there's the scope for an approach to CBT that places more emphasis on something like that. Ante Uito listed a whole bunch of techniques and is going to experiment with building a coping script. The meditations itself, as I mentioned earlier, can be seen almost like what we call a coping plan or a coping script in CBT, a little bit like that. There's a guy called Paconius Agrippinus, who was part of the Stoic opposition to Nero and Domitian, and one of Epictetus's big heroes as a Stoic. And he used to write letters to himself, wrote letters addressed to himself, praising catastrophes that befell him, like exile, presumably. He was exiled. And we know the Stoics wrote these consolation letters to other people. That's the only example we have where there's a reference apparently to somebody writing consolation letters to themselves. But then, again, it's another type of writing exercise that can be compared. It's not exactly the same as what Marcus is doing in the Meditations, but it can be compared. So we've got the consolation letters, we've got the Meditations of Marcus, we've got this idea of letters written to oneself. A number of different but related rhetorical or writing exercises in Stoicism. Jan talks about the importance of viewing things as transient, kind of like the Buddhists do. Marcus places a lot of emphasis on this, even compared to the other Stoics. In cognitive therapy, when clients picture or worry about upsetting events, you can often alleviate that a lot by just asking them to follow that through to completion. So sometimes we talk about following the image to completion, or just a train of worry. Move it on a few minutes, a few hours, a few days, whatever's most relevant to the type of worry it is, and then imagine what happens next. So the therapist might say, and then what, and then what, and what happens next, and what happens next. And people kind of tend to freeze at the worst part of a worry chain, but if they continue a little bit longer and imagine things moving on or returning to normal in a kind of realistic way, then anxiety tends to diminish considerably as a result. And you could say you can derail a lot of worry and anxiety just by, rather than trying to suppress a thought, just getting in the habit of moving it a couple of notches further on in the sequence. Even if it's nothing particularly positive, but imagine, somebody's worrying about a public speaking appearance going really badly. Just get them to imagine what happens like in the hours and days afterwards. And often it would just be that they gradually imagine themselves getting over it and returning to normal. But that tends to really take the edge off the anxiety, especially if you get into the habit of just moving the thought forward a little bit. There's a little practical tip for you from cognitive therapy. Sometimes these things are hard to explain because they seem trivial, small, little hints or tips, but for clients in therapy, frequently that's the sort of thing that will, shift them halfway towards their goal of overcoming the problem. It may just be something like that makes a big difference to them. Mark mentioned describing things with neutral language, and I'm going to talk more about that actually in week 3 when we get on to pain and illness. I call this abandoning rhetoric because in effect it means removing certain metaphors and figures of speech like hyperbole or exaggeration or minimizing things. I can't remember what that's called in Greek, but there's a name for minimizing or trivializing things in rhetoric as well. And in CBT we talk about thinking errors. Like some of those thinking errors just correspond to rhetorical figures of speech. Marcus abandoned rhetoric as a study. He continued studying it throughout his life, but he abandoned it as his main study and went through this big dramatic conversion when he was about 25, where he told Fronto that he was going to study Stoicism instead. And I think Fronto saw this as Junius Rusticus in particular, sort of stealing Marcus away from him as a student. But the interesting thing about that is it's often described in books on Marcus's life as this pivotal event where he abandons rhetoric and switches to becoming a devotee of Stoic philosophy instead. But Stoicism has a style of rhetoric of its own. Zeno and the other founders of the Stoa wrote books on rhetoric, but it's often not framed in that way because it was almost a kind of counter rhetoric, like the opposite of rhetoric. Their rhetoric, their style of writing and speaking was supposed to emphasize simplicity, conciseness, clarity, and to kind of fly in the face of traditional rhetoric with its flowery language and use of elaborate metaphors and so on, and strategic use of exaggeration and things. I believe that Stoic rhetoric, however, overlaps with the Stoic therapy of the passions, right? You're familiar with all those places in the Meditations where Marcus talks about describing things in objective language. It seems to me that's part of the stylistic advice that they give concerning the study of rhetoric. So, I mean, I really do very much think about therapy in those terms. If you have someone who's got public speaking anxiety and they have a bad experience, they might say things like, it was awful, everyone just shot me down in flames, right? That's rhetoric. Like, it's exaggeration or hyperbole. It's the use of a very graphic metaphor. They shot me down in flames. Like, why use that metaphor unless it's intended to evoke negative emotions and emotional reaction? So that may be good if you're kind of like trying to persuade an audience, but why would you say stuff like that in your own head? I mean, I mean that really seriously. It's always puzzled me as a therapist. Why would anybody use rhetoric like we use in talking to other people in their own internal dialogue when they're worrying or ruminating? But we do it very frequently. And people do it without thinking. It's a kind of abusive rhetoric. So we can use rhetoric to make ourselves anxious or depressed. And when we do the opposite in therapy, for example, we do decatastrophizing, we try to view things more objectively, it's noticeable that we're removing a lot of those rhetorical devices, stripping things down to a more bare bones, matter-of-fact way of describing events. If we all spoke to ourselves more objectively about upsetting events and put aside a lot of the rhetoric, we'd need half as much therapy, maybe no therapy. So I think the style of speech is very important, and that there's a lot potentially to be said about that. And then there were some other comments in the what next section. How do we do it for time? Oh, we're pretty much on schedule. Cool. In the what next section, David said there's great value to be had from reading and taking part in discussions, and as always, absolutely agree with that. I'd like to ask everyone who's watching this today just to go and read the main discussion again for week 2, and I'm going to ask you at the very least just to reply to someone else's comments and say thanks, that was helpful, or thanks, that was interesting. It's important because people invariably get more benefit from the discussions than they'd anticipate, and any kind of response tends to encourage more discussion to take place. But a lot of people will say, well, I don't have anything very deep or clever or insightful to say. It doesn't matter, just respond to other people's comments and say thanks for sharing or whatever. You know, that's reinforcement. It encourages more discussion, and then when you go back to the groups, there'll be more stuff going on, and you'll get much more benefit if there's more social interaction going on that way. We call that the social constructionist approach to learning, or social learning. R.J. McNeil Jr. said the history is helpful and compliments Hadot. And I just wanted to say, Pierre Hadot's The Inner Citadel is one of the most popular books on Marcus Aurelius' Stoicism. I wholeheartedly recommend it. And I guess second to that, the other book that I like people to read is the one I mentioned earlier, The Philosophical Regimen of the Earl of Shaftesbury. So that was a lightning tour of, we've covered the brief feedback forum, we've covered the comments on week 2, and now we're ready to go into the preview of week 3. So let me just check in very briefly with the comments before I do so. There's a couple of questions in there. Yeah, Okay, I'll respond to those at the end. The title of, again, I think of questions, post them now, I'll respond in the live chat, to the live chat at the end. Put @Donald at the beginning if you want to ask me something directly. Could you post the title of the book you showed, the one written by the Earl of Shaftesbury? It is called, look, you can pause that afterwards and read it. It's The Philosophical Regimen. It's in the recommended reading anyway, and I'm sure we've got a recommended reading page in the course, and this is listed in it. The Philosophical Regimen. It's called The Life, Unpublished Letters and Philosophical Regimen of Anthony, Earl of Shaftesbury. As far as I know, there's 2 editions of it. There's this one which is moderately expensive, and there's another one which is ridiculously, insanely expensive, if memory serves me correctly. So I'd probably opt for this one, the little paperback edition. And his letters and stuff are in it, which are kind of interesting, but it's mainly his version of the Meditations that I think everyone should read. It's awesome. If you want to kind of get a sample of that, if you look at my blog, which is on donaldrobertson.name, there are some excerpts from that, and I might actually take some excerpts from his book and put them in the course, because I think it would be useful for people to see how beautiful they are. Not everyone likes that style of writing. What is it, 16th century, 17th century, whatever. But if you can get used to that, if you're happy reading it, I think some of the passages in that book are insanely beautiful, and kind of they capture a lot of the spirit of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. And also he knows the Meditations, and he knows Epictetus inside out. He's a scholar of the Greek language that they use as well, and very familiar with the text that he's drawing on. So and a respected philosopher in his own right, so it's massively underrated book. Okay, preview of week 3, and it's about pain and illness, everyone's favourite. Kind of another one of my favourite topics. I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later. But I've got kind of a special interest in pain and illness, although my main specialism was anxiety. So we've got a video where I felt I hadn't said enough about this stage of Marcus's life. So in the video for this week, I talk a little bit more about the first Marcomannic War, which is the period in Marcus's life that we're talking about. And so there's a massive transition here. Like, basically, it's really simple. Marcus spent most of his life living in Rome, and then at the beginning of the Marcomannic War, he had to move to the northern frontier. And from that point forward, allegedly, he spent 8 years there before he really came back to Rome. So there's this huge transition to a completely different environment, from being at court as emperor in the house of Tiberius in his palace, surrounded by all these academics and intellectuals. Suddenly he's in the legionary fortresses, and he's surrounded by the army. He's fighting a war. His life just dramatically changed. The climate that he was in. We're told that his frailty meant that he struggled with the cold climate. And the plague was at its peak at the beginning of the first Marcomannic War. So there were people very visibly dying of plague. The signs of that would have been all around him. And even people who survived the plague would have been scarred with smallpox. So it's, he saw a lot of suffering. Aged 48, with these chronic health problems, spitting blood, vertigo, insomnia, stomach pain, chest pain, he couldn't eat food easily. At the height of a plague that claimed his mentors, his co-emperor, his brother, with no military experience as far as we're aware, Marcus rode out of Rome to the Danube. So we're talking about modern day Austria, Hungary, Serbia, the front line of the Marcomannic War, and commanded the largest army ever assembled on a Roman frontier. So approximately, including the auxiliaries, 140,000 men. So I like to emphasise that, because when we look at the letters between Marcus and Fronto, which we're going to be looking at in particular in week 3 when we're talking about pain, Marcus comes across as affable, affectionate, informal. They'll just let us between two friends. Like, he seems very charming and a very likable guy, and it's hard then to imagine this guy chatting away so informally to his friend about their kind of aches and pains and their families and stuff, being thrust into this position where he's commanding this massive army with no experience over a period of 8 years. And it's exceptional, but it presented apart from a tremendous psychological challenge, it seems to have been a huge physical challenge for Marcus. He was, by Roman standards, an old man. He was universally described as frail, and he had these health problems. So in the video I talk about some of the strategies used in pain management, because I know people like kind of summary lists and stuff, reminders of what we're talking about here. So the first one, there are 7 basically that I list off. The first one is separating the mind from the body. You don't have to be a dualist to do this, by the way, incidentally. You have to be a Cartesian to think about it this way. Marcus, when he talks about separating the mind from the body, really means cognitive distancing. He means maintaining a separation between our value judgments and external events. So in relation to pain and illness, that basically means realizing the pain in itself is neither good nor bad, unless we judge it to be a bad thing. Some people will judge pain to be an awful, a terrible thing. It's just a bodily sensation, though. Other people are much more indifferent about it. Sometimes people change their appraisal of it depending on the situation in which they're experiencing it. Some people even enjoy pain. Like some forms of pain are seen as a kind of necessary evil, and then they're viewed with more indifference in the normal run of things anyway. So it's our judgments that matter, but often we kind of fuse our judgments to the sensation and don't keep a line separating them. That's the first strategy, the most important one perhaps that Marcus is talking about. And it's similar to Epictetus saying it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. It's not pain that upsets us, it's our judgment about pain that really matters. Some people might find that hard to accept, but I'm going to persevere with that because I accept that that's a hard concept initially, but it's one I believe in, and I'll explain why in a moment. Strategy number 2, remembering that fear of pain does us more harm than the pain itself. Often Marcus talks about this. In therapy, we'd see that as a way of mobilizing our motivation for changing something, is getting people to reflect on the cons, like doing a cost and benefit analysis and getting them to think more about the short and long-term negative consequences of maintaining an attitude or a pattern of behaviour that we're looking at changing. That's extremely important in therapy. We do that with anxiety treatment as well. What's the cost of anxiety? To make it really vivid, get people to remember it, because that helps to boost their motivation for making change. So remembering the negative consequences of fearing pain. Number 3, viewing sensations objectively, like a physician or a natural philosopher, I would say, and analysing them. We do this in modern therapy as well. We tell clients to think about many people, different strategies work for different people, or different strategies work more easily for some people rather than others. In pain management, there's often a repertoire of strategies, and then you'll find some people just immediately latch onto one of them. Other people go, nah, that doesn't really do it for me. There are many people who just learn to view pain sensations with an attitude of scientific detachment, like anatomically, or like a doctor, and that kind of weird detachment. I used to have a needle phobia, quite a bad needle phobia, and then I started just kind of really visualizing it as if I could see what was happening through a microscope, and kind of imagining the cells being pushed apart by the needle and stuff, and then that took away a lot of the anxiety for me. And also practice as well. So viewing things objectively, analysing them into components, this is an integral part of a lot of modern therapy in general, but Marcus particularly talks about that in relation to pain. Number 4, viewing pain sensations as spatially limited and belonging to the body. Marcus talks about this quite a lot. Again, it sounds a bit dualist, but it isn't in any way necessarily related to metaphysical dualism. So I have a pain in my finger. Normally we kind of fuse with pain, we identify with it, we become immersed in it, but Marcus wants to remind himself to think of it as over there in the finger. Again, a kind of like a distancing approach in a way, but viewing it also maybe as just confined to a small area, and thinking of consciousness as limitless. Consciousness itself, phenomenologically, just as being like an invisible eyeball, like that's nowhere and everywhere at the same time. So thinking of consciousness as much bigger, and the sensation is just being this kind of small point. It sounds like a bit of an odd concept, but there's a lot of interest in self as context. It's called an acceptance and commitment therapy. Encouraging people to make this little phenomenological mind flip seems to be very effective as a coping strategy. So basically just viewing the pain as kind of small and limited in space, and the inner awareness is being more vast than it, enveloping it and separate from it. Viewing sensations as transient and changeable, Marcus talks about a lot, that they come and go, that they change, that they fluctuate, and just focusing on that and remembering that continuously can, a bit like what I said earlier about seeing worry as time limited and moving things forward, thinking about how pain comes and goes, and like how it will, we've had many similar pains and different uncomfortable sensations in the past, and they've all come and gone. So thinking about the transience of it, how these things can be changeable, leads to a certain amount of detachment from them. And number 6, letting go of the struggle against it as being bad or harmful and actively accepting it. That's always been part of pain management and behaviour therapy. There's acceptance and commitment therapy in particular now, and other forms of mindfulness-based CBT put a lot of emphasis on radically accepting, actively accepting sensations, consciously abandoning any attempt to struggle against sensations or try and get rid of them. The Cynics have some beautiful metaphors for describing that, which I've included some of them in the reading. We talk about grasping a nettle today, grasping the nettle of pain, of the sensation, not being scared of it, like embracing the sensation. They talk about, Diogenes the Cynic apparently talked about people being pursued by a pack of wild dogs, and how if you try to run from them, they'll snap at your heels and bear down on you even more, as if they're hunting prey that's fleeing from them. But if you have the confidence to stand up tall and turn around and face them, then they'll back away from you in fear. And this is just his kind of metaphor for describing pain and hardship. Like, if we can embrace the sensation, like him embracing the frozen statues, he thinks we learn to experience ourselves as bigger and stronger than the sensation. Whereas if we're always struggling against it, trying to get rid of it, then we kind of hand it more power. There are many problems that come as a result of trying to suppress pain sensations or struggle against them, but one of them is that even just at a physical level, we tend to tense our muscles more. So for headaches, chronic back pain and stuff like that, if you're focusing on and struggling and getting angry and annoyed with sensations and tensing more as a result, it's probably going to exacerbate some of your physical symptoms. But there are many other levels at which it's problematic to do that. And finally, number 7, asking what virtues we have that would help us to cope, which is, again, like I mentioned earlier, about dealing with boring situations. Ask yourself how someone else might cope with the pain or hardship or discomfort in a way that's praiseworthy or admirable. We can always think of good and bad ways of dealing with the same problem. So what would someone who's dealing with this well be doing? That's like saying, what virtues do we have that would allow us to cope? As I said, I'd come back around and talk about a bit my own experience in pain. It was never a major specialism of mine, but one of my mentors as a therapist, a guy called John Butler, who's based in London, is an expert on pain management. And John taught me how to do pain control demonstrations. So for many years as a therapist, a trainer of therapists, I used to pack my arm in ice. I used to attach Alice clamps to the back of my hand, because you have to induce pain in order to properly employ pain management strategies. I had a client once who was having a liver transplant, and if I'm teaching somebody to manage pain for something like that, it's much easier if I can model it first and do something that's reasonably painful and show how easy it can potentially be. So I was rubbish at learning how to do that. It took me like practicing every day for 2 weeks before I kind of had the courage to really get the knack of it. Virtually everyone else I've ever taught pain management, self-hypnosis to, has got the knack of it faster than I ever did. But then I did hundreds of times. I've demonstrated pain management techniques after that. And I used different approaches and techniques, but by the end of it, people would say, "What are you doing?" I'd kind of pass my hand over where the Alice clamps were, like pinching the back of my hand. I'd just kind of go like that without touching it. And I'd say to myself, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing, just like Epictetus tells his students to do. And I'd also say I can't think of, I've abandoned most of the visualization techniques and stuff that I learned. They helped me get there, but at the end of it, I was just telling myself it's just a sensation. Which again, similar to the Stoic perspective, it's not harmful, it's not bad, it's not dangerous, it's just a sensation like pressure or tickling or any other kind of sensation. So just kind of attitude, it's just another type of feeling. And I've had many similar painful sensations in the past, and they come and go. It's making it seem banal. And another little anecdote I'll just throw in about this. I don't know if do I have my resilience book kicking about? No. Oh, here it is. I'll be back in a second. This book is about third wave cognitive behavioural therapy, and there's a lot of stuff about Stoicism in it. And I'm very proud of the fact that my daughter Poppy is in the index of it. So she's one of the case studies. And Poppy was born at home. And her mother didn't use any pain medication at all, not even an aspirin. So Mandy used self-hypnosis for natural childbirth. So my little girl was a hypno baby. So pain management is kind of hard, because once you do something a lot, your attitude becomes it gets simpler and simpler and simpler until it's just a sensation. But there are many different strategies. I've mentioned 7 already. They're all good strategies. They're all comparable to ones that are used in cognitive behavioural therapy today. There's many research studies on the effectiveness of these strategies. I guess the other thing I'd say about pain management, having trained therapists in it, people always think it's going to be difficult, like there's something sort of dramatic about it. But you can get any bunch of random people and just show them a script to do, and 95% of them will be able to do it within the space of half an hour. It's much easier than people assume, basically. So the key thing really is just confidence. The excerpt, how are we doing for time? I'll just touch on this very briefly then. The excerpt's about Apollonius of Chalcedon and Claudius Maximus, 2 tutors of Marcus. Apollonius seems to have been a famous teacher who was based in Athens and then moved to Rome. There's a weird early 19th century book called The Eulogium on Marcus Aurelius, which portrays fictionally Apollonius of Chalcedon delivering a eulogy at the death of Marcus Aurelius. It's awesome. I'm going to see if I can get a version of it to you. Claudius Maximus, we kind of emphasise him in this part of the course. He was a military veteran, a high-ranking consular Roman statesman. Marcus was very impressed with his endurance in dealing with severe illness and the way that he was at the end when he died. The stories are about Marcus Fronto, his rhetoric teacher, how Fronto complains a lot, whinges about pain and illness in his letters to Marcus. And then Marcus quotes a letter from Epicurus, which contrasts dramatically with these earlier letters, because in it Epicurus says The main thing is don't chatter about your symptoms and whine about them and stuff. And so there's a obvious contrast between how Epicurus coped with illness and how he describes in this letter, and all these letters between Marcus and Fronto, maybe written 10 or 20 years earlier. Marcus went through this transformation to have himself a much more stoic attitude towards pain, less complaining, much more accepting, much more determined to master pain. How Marcus coped with pain and illness goes into a lot more detail about those 7 strategies, drawing on quotes from the Meditations. The audio download is new, it's kind of experimental. It's designed so you can do it during physical exercise. So one of the things Marcus says is view every uncomfortable sensation as a species of pain. And what he means by that is, he's absolutely right about this, you use the same strategies to deal with any physical sensation. So when you're teaching pain management, sometimes you might put bulldog clips on people's ears or nose or fingertips or whatever. And some people might say, well, I can't quite get a painful sensation, but I just kind of feel an uncomfortable pressure. In fact, it doesn't matter. Like, you're learning to deal with an unpleasant or uncomfortable sensation, whether it's a sharp pain or a dull ache or, just an annoying feeling. It kind of doesn't matter. But the fatigue that people have after they've been running for a long time, or the strain they feel from holding a yoga posture for a long time, might also be similar in terms of the strategies that you use to accept it, ride it out, endure it. So the audio download just gets you to try a bunch of different strategies. Again, some people will listen to that recording once and then they'll take one of the strategies and use it on their own. Other people might continue listening to it every day. I want to emphasize, that's why I haven't laid out a strict routine for using the recordings, because I know that everyone will use them differently. Some people will listen to them once and just take bits. Other people will use the recording verbatim. The discussion is about the pros and cons of these kind of strategies, but in particular, the idea of accepting pain and what that really means and what the pros and cons of that are, because I think that's really the cardinal technique here that we're interested in. And then there's a bonus article about the Antonine Plague, which is more a piece of historical fiction, although like the eulogium of Marcus Aurelius that I mentioned earlier, it's pretty authentic. It's very much based on the historical sources, but I thought you might find that interesting because it's an incredible thing, and it's hard for people to visualise, but if you read that article you have a much clearer picture of how dreadful the Antonine Plague actually was and how massive the scale of it was. And that's a major part of the context in which Marcus was living. So we're almost out of time. I've just got time to check in briefly with the chat questions, and let me see if I can pop that out and answer some of those. I think we've only got a few anyway. Yeah, we've not got loads. Okay, what about putting discussion in the content title to putting discussions into the content title to highlight them? Not sure I understand the question. So where we've got a discussion, put the question in or put the word discussion into the title of the page. Email me about that, and explain exactly what you mean, because I'm not sure I really understand which of those two things you're talking about. And the only other question we've got is, do you have any advice coming up with personal coping script based on the Meditations? That's quite a broad question, because it would depend what the problem is. And also the individuals tend to write coping scripts differently. My main piece of advice, really what I've mentioned already, is I read it every day. I'd recommend writing a script that's maybe, I don't know, like half a page. It depends on you, like how long's a piece of string. Like most people would write coping scripts at like maybe half a page or a page, and I think it helps a lot if people just read them out loud every day. maybe read it 3 times or something, and then just kind of periodically update it and revise it a little bit until you're kind of more and more comfortable with it. Some people will record it and listen to an audio recording of them reciting it, basically. But the main thing is to make it as kind of objective as possible, remove emotive language, make it realistic. Those are the main bits of advice I would give. There's a lot more technical advice I could give, but it would take time to explain, and it would kind of vary depending on the nature of the problem you're facing. The most generic advice I can give is just keep reading it and reviewing it, but actually read it aloud or listen to a recording of it, and that can help. Is it possible to perform CBT on myself, says Adam? Yeah. But I mean, CBT to a large extent is performed by the client anyway. It's the many CBT practitioners view themselves as basically empowering the client to become their own therapist, especially in order to maintain long-term improvement. Again, that varies a bit depending on the nature of the therapy and the problem, but broadly speaking, in CBT you're taught skills that you go off and do between sessions anyway. It's homework based, so that's easier with a therapist, but you can do most of that stuff yourself, and there are self-help versions of virtually every form of CBT. But it's harder, right? Otherwise nobody would bother paying therapists. It's not unlike doing physical exercise. What are the benefits of having a fitness coach? People find it easier, and they can give advice that's helpful. But you could go and read a self-help manual on CBT, and it would give you a lot of the same techniques that a therapist would give you anyway. But people find it easier if there's someone with them. There are some techniques that are harder to do on your own, like certain forms of exposure therapy. But yeah, you can do CBT on yourself, definitely. Putting discussions in parentheses. All right, sure. Yeah, we could put the word discussion after the. But it says it says at the top of the page anyway, in italics. Leave your comments below, so it should be fairly visible. Let me have a think about that though. Maybe we might be able to put something in to flag up this discussion. Okay, cool. So I think that's all the questions for today. We're not too far over. So thanks very much for coming along today. Fill out the brief feedback form if you haven't already. Good luck with week 3. As always, feel free to get in touch with me by email if you've got any questions whatsoever. And other than that, it's goodbye from me here in Nova Scotia, and goodbye from Mookie Dog. You gonna say goodbye? We've got a lot of Twitch of the years. It's goodbye from Mookie Dog.